I imagine that you will be so exhausted that you would decide to not turn up. I thought there might be half a dozen people here, so I'm pleased. You've exceeded my expectations. So, welcome all of you. I'm Miriam Taylor. And can you all hear me? Yes. Can you all understand me all right?
Yes. So far.
Can you speak a little slowly? When I get excited, I start to if you don't understand, please just let me know and we'll do our best to explain between us. But I have said to others, I feel very embarrassed that English is the dominant language because it's so associated with imperialism. And yeah, I'm slightly ashamed about it. But anyway, we have to have a language, as somebody pointed out, so it is my mother tongue. So, what we're talking about today, I feel like in a way you've already heard some of it from Donna Orange, some of it from Jim Kettner. Trauma has been touched on time and again throughout this conference. I don't know what I've got to add to it. I'm going to say it again, and if you get bored, go. I'll be saying it a different way, of course. So what I'm wanting to do is just to present a little bit of an update, so a slightly bigger picture on what I think of as one of the key messages and one of the key chapters from my book, Trauma Therapy and Clinical Practice. I've got some flyers for it here, literally just hot off the press is the Italian version, which you can get across the way here. If you speak Italian, I'll read it in Italian today. And I have some flyers with some information about it. So, what I am going to do first of all is just kind of situate some of this really thinking about dichotomies and splits that occur as a result of trauma. And I kind of want to ground some of my thinking about trauma very quickly in some basic neuroscience, and then talk about 3 different field models, which includes the therapeutic relationship. Okay. And I want to allow some time at the end for some thinking together and some questions together, and I hope that we can manage that. But first of all, we've had a few kind of shifts in the energy in the room. Just first of all, gather your energy into your centre, wherever that may be. Just bring your energy in. Not tightly. The word gather has a looseness about it for me. So don't force it, just bring it in and allow yourself to find your place and find your breath and where your ground is, and as you do it, I do it. And as you do it, I look, and I take you in differently. Okay, so I want to start just very quickly with an ethic, really, around this week. And we've heard a fair bit about Levinas I wouldn't say this weekend, but this week. This is one of his quotes that I happen to like, because I think it does speak to the ethic. Donna Orange touched on it. He says, there is a commandment in the appearance of the face, as if a master spoke to you. So that immediately shifts the power balance. If this is the master in the face of the other. It is in the service of the other that I do this. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute It is the poor for whom I can do all and to whom I owe all. Destitute, poor, we can think of other words that we can substitute for those words. Suffering is a good one, I guess. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about something that happened with a client of mine.
Could you speak to
so I'm going to talk about a clinical example. A young woman had been terribly brutalized in her past and came into therapy with me frequently having flashbacks and dissociating, very, very deeply out of contact. And with the sensory motor training that I have, I knew all the ways of helping her come back. And I tried them all, and we had been through this many, many times. Really having to focus my energy inwards. And a slight anxiety in me at the same time, but that sort of sense of being focused in, technically doing everything the correct way, and we knew together that this was a way of bringing her back into the here and now and able to engage in therapy. But one day I was sitting with her in this kind of state, and I just sat back and I opened myself, so I changed my focus. And as I did so, I experienced wave after wave after wave of nausea. And understood that this was something about her experience. I think I had in my sharp focus, my technical focus, was defending myself against the waves of nausea. But I was able to bring this back into the work and say, it feels like there's something really sickening going on. And the work took on a different pace and direction as a result of that, once I'd allowed myself to really feel into that. But when we're faced with people who have been brutalized in such ways, of course we need to defend ourselves. Of course we do have to find a way of being present and bearing witness, because it's pretty terrible. The material that we can hear and become exposed to can be pretty terrible and devastating for us. So I don't know what's causing that.
A mobile phone.
I think my phone is switched off. Not switched off. Somebody's phone. Hope it's okay. It scares me, this. Yeah. So I think this is the edge where I think there's this ethic about the work. The ethic in taking care of ourselves, finding our resilience, and the ethic in finding a way that we can support real content. So, I'm just going to move on now, just to a very quick overview of some neuroscience. I will say a few comments about neuroscience. I don't think that we can actually work with trauma without some understanding of neuroscience. I think it's absolutely necessary because it helps us to know what it is that we're working with and to understand some of the processes that kind of shape the client's phenomenology. However, I also hate neuroscience because it is so reductionistic, because it is so much grounded in the medical model, the one-person individual model. So I use it as a very much a background set of ideas. They are not the truth. I think it's a mistake to say this happens. What we know from neuroscience research is that certain things happen, but we don't really know what they are and what they mean. It's useful because it helps us to normalize things with our clients. We can give them a little bit of psychoeducation and say, this is what happens, you didn't have a choice. So having said all of that, let's just have a very quick look. So let's start with what a healthy brain looks like. It's an fMRI scan of a healthy brain. Not a particular amount of activity going on at that point. So I'm going to move on to one of 3 models. This one is called the triune brain. It is a very controversial model because it was developed by Paul MacLean in 1990. It's controversial because he thinks of it as an evolutionary model, and that's not been widely accepted. It's also somewhat controversial because anatomically it's not as distinct as this. It's a vastly oversimplified model of what goes on inside our skulls, but it gives us some sort of way of, some sort of language for understanding what goes on, which is why it's useful. And I think the 3 areas of the triune brain we can think of each in terms of having a function in terms of survival, and therefore it's useful. So the area that's highlighted here, this dark grey area, is the brain stem. So if I use my fist, Daniel Siegel uses this way of looking at it because it's useful. The brain stem, the deepest part of the brain, would be represented by the palm of my hand, and it goes down into the spinal cord. Okay? And that is responsible for things like our bodily temperature, our blood pressure, our appetite, our respiration, heart rate, our states of sleepiness and alertness, our states of consciousness. So if when the brainstem is injured in a car accident or something like that, it's really not going to be possible for someone to recover and to survive. Because all those organismic functions are going to be compromised. So absolutely in charge of the survival of the physical, biological organism. On top of that, represented by the back of my hand, is the limbic system, the limbic brain, and that is responsible for, it's really the seat that we get most interested in when we're thinking about trauma, because it's the seat of some of our fear responses, our automatic fight and flight responses. It looks after our emotional, sensory, motor functions, our social connections, and so those are all parts of our need to survive. There are certain structures in the limbic brain that are triggered in the presence of threat, and they react incredibly fast. We're talking about 1/20th of a microsecond for some of the fear structures, fear networks in the limbic brain to kick off and trigger a whole cascade of neurochemicals throughout the body, those motor responses, those sensory responses. So fight and flight particularly part of that area of the brain. Now, sitting on top of that, so we could represent that by my other hand coming on top, right underneath the skull is the cortex, responsible for survival because it helps us put things into language, so we can ask for help, we can think things through, plan, make strategies. So really necessary. So we can just think about those different. I'm so worried because you can't see so well. Would it help if you came and sat in the front here? Don't move if you need to. So we can think about those trauma responses, the freeze and collapse associated with the brainstem, fight and flight associated with the limbic system, and attachment and social engagement, which Jim Kettner was talking about this morning, associated with the language in part that we can form in the cortex. So we can think about defences that are active, mobilised, fight and flight, and defences that are immobilised, the freeze and submit defences. And freeze and submit are they really kind of define a nasty trauma reaction and PTSD and complex trauma. It's when someone has not been able to act that they get really stuck in a loop of trauma responses that gets maintained. And basically, just to say, basically these responses are initially designed to help. They are there for our survival. But as we know, we get into kind of fixed gestalts that are no longer useful, creative adjustments that are no longer useful, served us well at the time of whatever experience we had, but are no longer useful. And they tend to reinforce the trauma response in an individual. So I'm just going to skip over this very quickly because some of you will have heard Jim Kettner was talking about the vagus nerve this morning. But again, really just showing how it's not just what happens in here that we need to be concerned about, because the vagus nerve coming from the brainstem involves the visceral organs. So when something charged happens in a therapy session, something starts to move, you will know that your client's tummy starts to rumble. Yeah? You ever noticed that? And they say, oh, sorry, I'm just hungry. And actually, it's probably some kind of activation of the vagus nerve. So, under stress, we can move in one direction or another. Just very briefly, complexity theory teaches us that a stressed system responds in one of two ways. Either going into chaos or going into rigidity. We'll put the theory into this now, so we'll talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. If you want to come and sit nearer, please do, just so that you can see. One of the things that I think is absolutely central to working with trauma is the window of tolerance model. This is a model that I learnt quite a number of years ago now, and I place at the centre of all my work. I think we could talk Gestalt and we could think about levels of arousal that are in the cycle of experience. That is a model of arousal, because we talk about excitement as being a huge part of how we understand Gestalt. This is a model about excitement, in a sense. What happens when it goes wrong. So again, Dan Siegel is the person who really brought this concept forward. This is my interpretation of his model, and it's based on, trying to find a way through, it's based on the way that the autonomic nervous system works. If you were listening to Jim Kepler this morning, he talked quite a bit about that. We all have an autonomic nervous system, and this model does not just apply to trauma. It applies to every one of us in whatever situations we find ourselves. So theoretically, we can diverge from this window of tolerance, this optimal state of arousal, into hyperarousal, which I think relates more to the chaos, the chaotic state, where everything starts to get cranked up and goes into overdrive. Things speed up and start to feel overwhelming. I think everybody in the last few days has known something about overwhelm. Just in this conference has been quite overwhelming at times. And so you may recognise anxiety, things going too fast and all being too much. And then below that is more like the rigid state where things start to shut down and desensitized, numb, a bit foggy, cut off, can lead in its most extreme state to levels of dissociation. I think of dissociation as being an extreme form of desensitization that on a continuum. So here is an image of a brain taken somebody in the middle of a flashback. Lots of activity going on. Don't worry too much about the words, just pay attention to the amount of black and white in that image. By contrast, this is an image of somebody who is dissociated. Now, as I said, we don't really know what this means. We can't interpret it and say this means that this person will be feeling. We can't make predictions from it. But I think it's very interesting and very startling because it shows us that something is happening, and they're both trauma responses. So I just want to go back to, just a moment, to the window of tolerance model and say that I said I can't really work without it. It is a whole body model. It says that everything that we do involves the whole body. And I haven't found a client yet, traumatized or not, who doesn't understand that model. So I show it to everybody, and we talk about it, and we figure out what being hyper-aroused means to them, and what being hypo-aroused might mean, and how much of space is available in that window in the middle, and what we might need to do in different situations to help support that. And I'm going to make or sound like a contradictory and maybe controversial statement, which is that I don't believe that it actually happens like that. And I'll explain why in a bit. So, that's got the neuroscience mostly out of the way. Let's come on and have a look at this idea of fields of mutual influence. There are three fields that we're going to talk about. in the next 40 minutes or so. And I think this is, so we're beginning to situate trauma relationally. Trauma happens in a context. And one of the experiences that's very typical in people who've experienced trauma is that they feel like there is no context. They feel cut off from everything that they have known, experienced, felt about themselves, about the people around them, about the world that they live in. There's a real sense of being disconnected from normal life. Given the givens of life, the assumption of safety. What's it like to experience an earthquake near Rome? To be in the middle of the night, asleep in your bed, and suddenly your house is gone, your family are injured or dead. You have nothing. It completely, traumatic events completely wipe out some of those fundamental assurances that we have. So here's a quote from Robert Stollerow that I like. He was writing about his own trauma, his own experience of trauma, and I actually borrowed from this quote to take the title of the third part of my book, which is all about the relationship. When my traumatized state could not find a relational home, I became deadened and my world became dulled. When such a home became once again present, I came alive and the vividness of my world returned. Really talking about relationship. Now we know this man, Philip Lichtenberg. I am a function of what you bring to me. I want to turn this one around. It's so nice to talk to a Gestalt audience. I don't have to explain what this means. Talk outside of Gestalt, we have to talk about what a function of self is and all that stuff. And I want to turn it around and say, you are a function of what I bring to you. I find that less comfortable. I don't know if that's my British reserve, but I find that less comfortable. But I think we need to be able to think in this kind of way, that we influence one another. So let us have a look, first of all, at the field of trauma contagion. This is a term from Louis Cossolino, from his book, The Making of a Therapist. And I kind of prefer it to vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization. It feels, partly because it's more phenomenological, it does feel like you're catching something when you sit in the presence of someone who has experienced trauma. Now, he says, I'm not quoting directly, because I'm not following my notes as closely as I could be. But Louis Cossolino does say that to feel this trauma contagion is not a sign of our weakness. It is not a lack of our professionalism. It is just a biological function of being with someone. Our biology, our fear circuits start to become activated when we're in the presence of someone who is experiencing enormous trauma. So let's have a little look at the properties of a traumatized field. This is not always the case. If you're talking about an earthquake, you don't have a perpetrator, but you certainly have victims. But in a relational sense, in relational trauma, there will be somebody or some people taking the role of perpetrator, and somebody or some people taking the role of victim. And the protector role, the person who might be able to intervene, is absent or neutralised. The perpetrator's impulses overwhelm them and can't be controlled. I've just been in a workshop about I get interested in strange subjects about violence and about the murder of men who murder women. I've just come from that. And this thinking is absolutely consistent with that. They can't manage their own impulses. And there will be a level of dissociation and amnesia. And because trauma is so big, it gets fragmented. Because it can't be contained, a natural response is to sort of parcel it up into more manageable doses. This is where the splits start to come in. There will be, of course, anxiety, fear and threat, and very often silence, secrecy and victim blaming. So the first sentence of my book is, trauma by its very nature creates splits at multiple levels. And I go on to situate that in a more social field, how trauma gets reflected in institutions, organizations, families, communities. The violence exerted every day in families, factories, workshops, banks, offices, police stations, prisons, even hospitals and schools, is, in the last analysis, the product of inert violence of economic structures and social mechanisms relayed by the active violence of people. So we go beyond you and me and any violence that might occur between us. We go beyond the family. We go and can think about the traumatized field existing throughout society. It is throughout all the structures of society. I will tell you fairly quickly about another client. A young man who I will name Luke. Luke was 14 when I first met him, and I worked with him for about 4 years. Luke's the first years of his life were absolutely characterized by violence of an extreme nature. That was the ground that he lived in. Violence and a complete failure to recognize that children were any different, or the needs of children were any different from the needs of adults. His older brother had died, and his father was at least indirectly responsible. And I say at least because he may have been directly responsible for his brother's death. What we do know is that his father later went to prison for murdering another partner's son. So you begin to get the feel for the level of violence that we're talking about. And when he was 3, Luke was beaten to within an inch of his life by his mother's boyfriend. He spent 9 weeks in hospital and had 5 operations and was then given up for adoption. So now you've just heard that story, just drop into yourselves. Come back to your breathing. Feel the seat underneath your ground. Your feet on the floor. If you're affected, make sure both your feet are well planted on the floor. And take some good breaths. And from this place, ask yourself a question. Right here and right now, how do I know that I'm alive? What's telling you that you're alive?
My sensations.
Sensations? Here? You feel something? Anything else?
My legs
Your legs.
are very heavy.
Your legs are
rounded.
The weight of my body, the weight
The weight.
of my body,
The weight of your body
and the rhythm of my heart.
and the rhythm of your heart. Yeah.
I feel broken in my stomach.
You feel broken. And what's the sensation? Can you describe the sensation of broken in here?
A feelings of emptiness.
Emptiness.
It's like a beginning of crying.
What happened was that as I became Luke's therapist, I became disconnected from other professionals in his field. For a variety of complicated reasons. I sometimes made approaches that I was not responded to. It felt to me as though the trauma had been dissociated. I was holding the trauma separate from the schools, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the social workers, that many other professionals who were working with him. Very disturbed young man, understandably. But what happened was that almost every week there was an incident. And the incident would be stealing or violence or smashing things up or running away. And oh look, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened.
How old was
He was 14 when I first met him. Yeah. And there was the hyper-arousal of his internal process reflected in the wider field. And the hypo-arousal of his internal process was reflected in my disconnection from all these other professionals. And I think this is part of the trauma contagion. It cannot be contained. So it spills out. And I think one of the main challenges for us as therapists working with trauma is to become aware of our own relationship to trauma. I'm not talking about history. I'm talking about what happens to us right now. What happened to you right now in this room? Did you disconnect? Did you feel very agitated? You know, it is those immediate responses that we need to attend to. And we need also to attend to our own propensity for violence, our own capacity for violence. I'm going to skip through a little bit here. Yeah, let's come to this one because I think this is important. A constant self-mobilization for alarm, a state of constant hyperarousal is perhaps a reasonable response to a view of late modern history as a chronic state of emergency. This is the society that we live in, particularly in the age of terrorism that we live in. What does it take to understand our reality as a chronic state of emergency, as a nervous system? The nervous system of our society. So just quickly come into some of the relational dynamics around trauma. Power, passivity, attachment issues. We could spend a while talking about each of these. Shame, ruptures, blaming, enactment, blame and responsibility, and a loss of intersubjectivity. This goes with a traumatized state, a traumatized brain. Again, I'm just going to skip over some of these because we are conscious of time. Yes, I'm just moving on.
Are those things in your book, Miriam?
No, these things are not in my book. This is another step that I've taken, just thinking more, really from clients like Luke, have helped me to understand more about the traumatized world that we live in. And that and something that happened in Britain. I think in the States you have a whole issue around, is it Bill Crosby? Yeah. We had somebody who had been a celebrity TV personality, disc jockey, called Jimmy Savile. And it was only after he died that stories started emerging of the abuse that he had perpetrated starting back in the 1960s, and involving institutions, involving police forces, not investigating reports, involving threats that he would bring his legal representatives in, throwing in heavy weights if anybody followed up any allegations. It appears that he abused over 400 people, often patients in hospitals, in special schools. We had an institutional, political, legal level of cover-up and denial, which is part of how trauma is responded to. Okay, let's move on. This brings us a little bit into the therapeutic relationship. The shared mindful field is a concept that I picked up from an article by Neil Harris in the British Gestalt Journal, and I like it very much. I think it deserves a wider press, because this is part of what we need to be able to offer our clients. Because if we go back to the triune brain, mindfulness is one of the things that most helps to integrate the limbic brain and the cortex. What I forgot to say earlier, and most importantly, when someone's in a traumatized state, it is as though the cortex doesn't function. It is as though it's as though it's disconnected. And brain studies have shown that. There's much less activity in the cortical parts of the brain when someone is in a traumatized state. So we have to try and get it back online, and mindfulness is one of the most integrative ways that we can do that. And I'm not necessarily talking about that kind of mindfulness. I'm talking about really detailed phenomenological exploration. It induces a mindful state. That level of differentiation that comes from knowing whether one part of the body feels hot or cold or tight or energized really helps to integrate some of the experience of self. But let's just have a little look at this. Trauma therapy profoundly changes the therapist. We give up our familiar ways of being and beliefs about the world when we embark on this work with survivors of traumatic life events. These changes are both inspiring and disturbing, involving gains and losses. Rarely do therapists enter the field of trauma therapy with full understanding of the implications of their choice. This, I believe, is true. I've been working with trauma for 20 years, and I believe that this to be true. It has changed me, and in some ways for the better, and in some ways I've become much more cynical about the world. I've become less trusting of certain people, certain kinds of situations. And I've become sometimes very shocked and deadened by things. So, we have been drip-fed traumatic narratives. We are watched by clients to see if we retaliate, give up, get ill.
Can you explain drip-fed?
Explain.
Drip-fed?
Drip-fed. The drips. One drip at a time.
Little by little.
Yeah? They give us just a little piece at a time. Yeah? And only when we show that we are still standing is it possible for the next drip to be given. We take on cruelty and pain on a level we may never have experienced. So I can think about an occasion with Luke when he was learning more about his early years that people had protected him from. They hadn't told him the story. When he started to hear the story, he came to me one day with a packet full of papers. Oh, no, he came to me one day and said, I've got some things that I want to show you. I've been learning about my mother and my father. And he said, man, it's really messed up. But I forgot to bring it. I'll bring it next week. Here's the first drip. He's just preparing me. Yeah? So he comes in the next week and he's got these papers. I'll show you this one, he says. Hands me a piece. Waits, watches while I read it. While we talk about it, while I really feel the impact. Comes back to it. And I'll show you this one. Hands me another piece. 3 times in that session, he paced it. He paced me. He regulated me as best he could. In order to help me hear his story and contain it. Now,
What happened to him?
what happened to him? He will be 20 in a few days' time. I was in contact with, well, his mother contacted me a couple of weeks ago, and said that he's volunteering to work with a Christian charity. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that he is not in prison. Yeah, I mean, it really is extraordinary that he's not in prison. I'm not going to take all the credit for that, but so this was his adoptive mother, who I have a relationship with. But yeah, so I fairly recent, although I'm not working with him, fairly recent news of him, and she was so delighted that he seemed to be committed to something for the first time. We'll see. Okay. Now, we need to look at ourselves as therapists and what we're bringing and how we can regulate ourselves. So Gary Yontag saying to us, if the patient goes away from a session feeling bad about him or herself, attributing negative thoughts or feelings to the therapist, this is an event in which the therapist plays a part. Coming now to branch after the Stolero on a similar tack. To insist that when patients feel endangered by a therapist, their perceptions of him must be faulty, in effect constitutes a cordon sanitaire around the therapist. It precludes unhampered investigations of the therapist's subjective reality, patients, yeah, so that the persecutory experiences, they see us as persecutor, can be understood at greater depth, including the therapist's unwitting contribution to them. We really have to be willing to expose ourselves to those levels of criticism, attack, the experience that a client who knows nothing other than the dynamic of victim and persecutor will place us into persecutor role. But if we say, oh no, it's just about your story, this is your past, this is how you repeat relationships, we stop looking at ourselves and we stop looking at how we might have contributed. And we need to really be robust enough to consider that. We need to consider the mission that we set out on when we become therapists and the elements of our own personal history that shaped us as therapists. Who are we trying to help? Who are we trying to rescue? Who were we trying to rescue when we became therapists? Was it ourselves? Was it your alcoholic mother? Psychotic father? Whoever. We need to think about these things and how we play a part that hooks in. And we need also to think about how we get bent out of shape. Just think for a moment how you would know that you were beginning to get bent out of shape with a client. What would tell you? For me, it's a very small shift in the base of my spine. I tighten, perhaps just a little bit, but it lifts me off the ground a fraction. I'm exaggerating even doing this, but it does just shift my balance. I'm less grounded, I'm less centered. That's my early warning signal. And I can either go back into the ground or use it to engage in a more active way. I have a choice when I notice that. What happens with you? How would you know?
I find my shoulders.
Yeah, me too.
Sorry?
When I find my shoulders.
It would be your
Suddenly
shoulders.
there and there.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I
push feel my body so hard. I'm pushing my head.
You go into your head and run.
Yeah, I start thinking.
You stop thinking.
I start thinking.
You start thinking.
Thinking about things.
All right. And I can see you kind of do a...
Yeah.
Starts to get a little bit hyper aroused.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. This is the trauma contagion. You're catching it. Yeah.
The breathing.
Breathing. Okay. Yeah.
I might feel anger.
Anger.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So a whole variety of ways. I'd suggest it's really important that you become familiar with these early warning signs, because your body is a great resource. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the properties of a shared mindful field, where it will be safe, reliable, where there is the possibility of being present. It's reflective rather than reactive. It brings us into the here and now. There is awareness, feels integrated, regulated, respectful, contactful, self-organizing, and mutual or reciprocal. We're just talking about that window of tolerance, aren't we? When we can find that window of tolerance within the presence of our client, we start to achieve the shared mindful field. So I think this is the most important concept. This is in my book. I think this is the most important concept. That what we need as therapists is a more robust, a wider window of tolerance that can encompass the extremes of hyperarousal and hypoarousal that our clients will bring to us. We need to find a way to stay present and inclusive in the presence of those extremes. So our own window of tolerance needs a great deal of support. So, Donna Orange was talking yesterday about the internal chorus. I think she was talking about the same thing, but I put it slightly differently. And the bit that I would add to that is really the role of our own embodiment in creating that shared mindful field, that increased window of tolerance that we need. That ability to stay with ourselves without going too far over into that field of trauma contagion. I think there is something about the mirror neuron system. Are you familiar with mirror neurons? Yes. Yeah? It's active. We pick up the client's trauma. But we need to be able to turn it around and offer them our level of mindfulness, of presence, of embodiment, of relationality, you know, the reconnection with intersubjectivity. Okay, now I have this in book or a version of it, and I'm still playing with it. I can't get the words quite right. Attempt. There is something about how I become present, and my presence supports you to become present, and your presence supports me, and so we go round unless one or other of us loses our presence. This is a mutually reinforcing system. This is why I don't believe that that window of tolerance model works in the way that it's traditionally represented. This is why I think this is a two-person model. And or a multi-person model, not a one-person model. Yeah, I'm still not happy with the words, but I think you'll probably get the idea that this is mutually reinforcing. So, there's lots of stuff out there about the self-care of the therapist, and it's quite popular, and how we prevent vicarious traumatization. I think that's very much out there as a sort of one-person thing. I've got to look after myself in the face of all these troubled people. I agree with Donna Orange that we don't do this just for ourselves. We do this in the service of the client, in order to be able to give back, in order to be able to meet their pain and their vulnerability and their fear, their terror. And that's the ethic. And so I'm saying it slightly differently, but it is. I think it's, as I understood their message, it is a very similar way of thinking. Okay. So let's come on to the third field of mutual influence, and this is the unitary field. Malcolm Parlett's idea that it's not just about you and your trauma, or you and me as therapist and client. It's about all of us. Malcolm says, identification with is to be aligned with or to join together, while alienation from involves distancing from the other. And with this distancing goes a small, subtle and yet discernible reduction in the personhood of the other or others. All of us are part of this phenomenon of identifying and alienating. And he refers to a peace organizer who tries to galvanize her groups into collective action by emphasizing what we are up against. How we meet other, or how we define other. Problematic, eh? Difficult to find the words. I'm going to come to this one. Extreme forms of us versus them can result in a social self-identity predicated on a stigmatized, devalued notion of the other as the enemy. A kind of collective post-traumatic stress disorder may predispose certain wronged populations to a hypersensitivity and hypervigilance that can lead to another cycle of slaughtering in self-defense. This doesn't come from the world of psychotherapy. This comes from social anthropology. We think about another kind of dichotomy, gender. Marderosian talking about the representation of violence being inseparable from the notion of gender. Violence is engendered in representation. What she is really saying is that we need to come away from biological notions of gender and think about violence as being masculine and submission or victimhood as being feminine. Whether the perpetrator is biologically male or female, it is regardless of gender. But we need to shift our thinking from men bad, women victim to our own capacity, or whatever our biological gender, to commit violence and to become victims. And by victim, I use that word really to mean someone who has been hurt. I don't mean it in a pejorative sense here. So, the task at hand, if this silence is to be broken, is to identify the forces conspiring to promote suffering. And what I'm suggesting here is that the suffering is a result of the splitting and the dichotomies, with the understanding that these will be differently weighted in different settings. So field sensitive, field contextualizing. In so doing, we stand a chance of understanding the force motrice, the leverage, if you like, of extreme suffering. A sound analytic purchase on the dynamics and distribution of such affliction is perhaps a prerequisite to preventing or at least assuaging it. So this is my interest. Let's understand the forces. Let's understand the dynamics that go on so that we can begin to arrive at a solution. So some properties of a unitary field. It's integrated, flexible, responsive, responsible, emergent, self-organizing, awake, present, compassionate, vulnerable, and complex. Again, much in common with this idea of the window of tolerance. So we need to be thinking about a societal window of tolerance. So, the British Gestalt community, we have an annual lecture in memory of Miriam Taylor, who was a Gestalt therapist and trainer. And I think 3 years ago now, 2 years ago, a woman called Scilla Elworthy presented on that occasion. Talking about non-violent conflict resolution. Scilla Elworthy is a peace activist who has worked with Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, organisations and in war zones across the world. It's a long experience of peace work. And she talked about turning the cycle of violence around through building physical security, for example, ceasefires, weapons amnesties, refuges, by building political security, equality, human rights, free elections, the right to demonstrate, by building psychological security, which we'll pick up in the next slide, and by working at a spiritual level, forgiveness, compassion training, use of ritual, vigils, hope and prayer.
Vigils.
A vigil is a keeping watch in honour of some tragedy, where people light candles. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's come to this psychological security. Involving respect, deep listening, the building of trust, which we know is hugely important in trauma, cross-boundary operations. Here we come in trauma counselling, dialogue, truth and reconciliation. So just a few slides here to end with. Listening, the medical aid, refugee camps, the arms amnesty. So, let's spend the rest of the time thinking about some questions. So you are bound to have some questions. I have some questions as well, because I'm not sure about any of this. These are just ideas. One of the first things that I'm interested in is, and you might be interested in discussing, is PTSD an inevitable biological event in the face of overwhelming threat, or Is it a structure of a complex, developed world? We can think about that. We can think about that relationship between society and biology, if you like. So what are the limits, if any, of a field theory of trauma? Can we decouple sexuality and violence, and gender and violence? And how might psychotherapy perpetuate aspects of the traumatized field? So just some questions to get you thinking. What are you doing with this? You don't have to respond to those questions if you've got other questions or thoughts, or just have a conversation.
Just thinking of PTSD in society and thinking of the space to discuss inside or outside of therapy, actually more thinking outside of therapy, and the room for dialogue, for sharing. And it seems to me that PTSD is increased by society if there's not a space for discussion, if there's not a space for someone who has been traumatized to share that trauma in whatever way that is. And I think society struggles sometimes to, for reasons we've just discussed.
For reasons we've discussed.
So therefore, when society does struggle, and when communities are unable to have that, or families are unable to have that dialogue, then there's more chance of PTSD.
Yeah. Okay. Can everybody hear what's been said?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So correct me if I'm not getting this quite the way you'd like. The comment is really about the amount of space that's needed to have the dialogue about PTSD, and if we can have the dialogue, then there will be less chance of it arising as a condition. Is that about right? Like we need to find the space, the opportunities to talk about it.
I think so. I think if I give a personal example, I feel my own experience of trauma has been exacerbated by a lack of room for dialogue within my family about the experience, and no doubt for me that it's been increased. It's actually exponentially been increased, almost in relation to how much it's not allowed to be talked about. I find it's almost a direct correlation for me in that experience.
Well, in some ways it's not allowed to be talked about because both the people who are close are affected too, and because there is a fear that if it's talked about in an uncontained way, it will escalate. We need to find the container, I think, and so finding the parameters of the space to talk about it is one of the challenges. We need to find a way to contain it.
And that for me is a fundamental question. You said towards the start of the talk it cannot be contained. You said something that, I don't know the words, that trauma, or something around it cannot be contained.
Well, it can be.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the limits are.
Yeah.
Of how big the container has to be, or whether we just need multiple manageable containers that become part of a bigger whole. Bigger kind of rhetoric around safety and meeting contact.
I just wanted to say something about children in particular. I work predominantly with children, and interestingly enough, I've just begun to work for an adoption agency in the UK. And I was really moved by what you said about Luke not ending up in prison, because my experience of working with children in the care system over a prolonged, and I'm talking many, many years, is watching them And I've worked with children who I've seen in foster care placements, and then 3 years later I've gone to a secure centre, and they're there because they've committed murder or violence, and so I have an experience of children who really, you are very lucky to get through this system that is there to care for you, that has removed you from your family. And one of the things that I feel really passionate about and also very traumatized by is the lack of attention and the lack of support that is available for children who are removed from their families because of some hideous traumatic event and then placed into the care system in the UK, which is
meant to help.
Traumatic because it isn't supportive and children do get moved a lot. But what I was really impacted by was your account of how when you worked with Luke, you became alienated from the other professionals, because I've only just started to work in this adoption agency, and I suddenly feel very overwhelmed by the work that's being handed to me in terms of feeling that perhaps what I'm being asked to work, the ways in which I'm being asked to work are actually quite overwhelming in and of themselves. And that whole process of the arousal, the dysregulated state begins immediately. I was working the other day and I immediately felt completely dysregulated within, I would say, 10, 15 minutes of the first or second session, because we're dealing with the drama. But we can't get anywhere near the boy because we're dealing with a drama in the behaviour of something that's happened with the boy that day. And it just feels like I'm in a corridor and it's getting longer and longer and longer and longer, and I can't. It's just very complex.
Come back to your body, come back to your breathing, find your ground, find all the resources that you need. I think, I didn't say it earlier, but I actually have quite a small private practice. I do a lot of teaching and supervision, but I keep my client numbers fairly low. And I like to go out for walks during the day, and I like to chop vegetables and make soup, and I meditate, and I read, and I enjoy films, literature, and I have a good life. And I make sure that I have a good life in order to do this work. I maintain that is what my clients pay me to do. So that my window of tolerance, it's not a guarantee under any circumstances. I'm just as prone to getting activated, but I can find my way back to my window of tolerance pretty quickly. And I have to be able to do that. But that's what my clients pay me for. They don't pay me for what happens face to face. They pay me to really manage my own boundaries and my own trauma, my own activation, my own body, my own well-being. That, I feel, is absolutely clear to me. That's what it's about. So you can enjoy it. It doesn't all have to be agony.
Well, I really like what you're saying. And this is so multiple thoughts I'm having, so I'm going to struggle a little bit with it. Because the way you describe how you live and who you are allows you to be so very present. Okay, so, and what I was thinking, you asked the question of how we might re-traumatize. And so for me, it would be a disconnect, which from the client in the room, from my the women or the girls that I see, because that's also the population that I see. So the theme for them has been isolation and lack of support experienced during a traumatic event.
Yep.
So if I am not present for them in the telling or in the sharing or in the room for whatever's going on in our relating, I'm then again violating. And so what you're saying to me is essential, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And Jim said it, thank you.
Yes,
Thank
I
you,
know,
Ronnie,
but
but
my mentors.
Jim said it this morning, and I've heard him say it before, that if there's only going to be one person present in the room, it had better be the therapist. He said it this morning. I guess it's phrases, but he's right. You know? We and staying present and practicing inclusion is really bloody hard with these clients. It's not easy. It challenges us on so many levels. And I also, I think there's a caveat here. When you work with someone whose ground experience is full of shame, shame is inevitably going to arise in the therapy. You will shame someone. Likewise with trauma, you will, I guarantee, trigger your clients into some kind of flashback, dissociation, reenactment. It will happen. You can't avoid it. So it's not that it's wrong when a client has a flashback in a session. You haven't done something wrong. It's that you need to understand it, you need to be aware of it, you need to figure out what's going on between you as part of the recovery. And it's that awareness that's the important piece. It's never my intention to traumatize anyone. Never. But it happens, week in, week out. So yeah, don't blame yourself. Don't give yourself a hard time for it. But just, be compassionate towards yourselves. And have awareness. How are we doing? You probably take one more question or comment.
I just want to say that I'm impressed by your careful way of giving us some. You are very careful in your words and in your giving us the theory, and I like it very much. And also the way you ask the questions, I have to chew on them, but it is really something that I can take with me. It's a gift. I experience it as a gift that I got from you. So thank you. Thank you
You're very welcome. Okay, we can still take one more comment or question. Fairly quickly, we've got a minute or two.
Is there anything special that you do in terms of working with the shame?
With working with shame? Only what we have written in the Gestalt literature. But shame and trauma go hand in hand. There's plenty of literature out there that really talks about shame as being one of the most dysregulating emotions. And plenty of literature that comes from relational psychoanalysis. Shame is an emotion that we are most likely to dissociate from. So when you look at shame through the lens of trauma, it is slightly different, but you handle it in a similar kind of way. You just need to recognise that there's another layer in there. But traumatic events that make us feel completely helpless or out of control are by their nature shaming. We feel little, we feel helpless, we feel humiliated. It's nasty. Yeah. Thank you very much. We've had breakneck